All right, welcome to video 2. We are now on page 5 of our ecology packet. And so we just, in the last video, defined the word niche, and we just to kind of review, should have this written down already on page 4, that niche is the job or the role of an organism and what it has in its ecosystem. And so if you look at the following here, let's look at this. So what do you think the job of a tree would be? So if you said producer, you would be correct. Maybe its job is to provide habitat. Maybe its job is to provide glucose. Maybe its job is to provide oxygen. Maybe its job is to filter carbon dioxide from the environment. Producers have a lot of different jobs in the environment. When you look at the frog, maybe the frog's niche is to be a consumer, to eat certain insects to keep their populations in control. You know, you might not think like, oh, why would what something eats be a job? Well, if you are responsible for eating a certain species in the ecosystem, you're keeping their population in control so that they don't get outnumbered. And so it is important. Predators are important in ecosystems so that lower level organisms on the food web don't overtake the ecosystem and don't grow out of balance. When we talk about food webs officially, which will be after this video, we'll be ready for our food web energy pyramid, we have to know that energy pyramids and food webs are a very, very specific balance. And so everybody's role in the ecosystem is important, and especially those predators. What do you think a job of a bee would be? If you guessed maybe pollinator, that is 100% a good guess. Different insects are different types of pollinators, and bees are definitely one of those where they're responsible for taking pollen from one plant to another plant. And then going back to the idea of why predators are important, if you look at the bear, you know that the bear is definitely important for the ecosystem because what it is responsible for controlling the ecosystem, controlling the populations of the species below it on the food web. So here's a picture of a regions question. And this one kind of goes into the bird analogy we used in the first video. The ecological niches of 3 bird species are shown in the diagram. What is the advantage of each bird species? So I'm just going to highlight real quick the word advantage, okay, of these different bird species having a different niche. So why is it good that they have different niches? As for the birds, feed higher in the tree, available energy increases. More abiotic resources are available for each bird. Predators are less likely to feed on birds in a variety of locations, or there's less competition for food. When we look at why it's important that organisms have different niches, it only deals with competition. Okay? So, why isn't number 2 true? If number 2 said biotic, actually maybe I wrote a highlighter. If it said biotic and that was crossed off, that would also be a correct answer. But it doesn't say biotic, it says abiotic. No matter where you are in the tree, the temperature, the light, all those different things are not going to be more or less available for a bird in this particular question. So the answer is there's less competition for food. Looking at this picture, going back to that tree analogy, this is a diagram from my my college book, is all the different, they're all different niches. This bird is responsible for eating on the top of that tree. This bird is responsible for eating in the middle of the tree. This bird is responsible for areas right here and then on the bottom of the tree. Oh, sorry about that circle. And this one's responsible for eating in the middle. And this is responsible for just eating around the edges. Okay? So these birds can all be in the same tree. They just can't be in the same part of the tree and eat from the same part because then they're going to start to compete, and that's going to be something that we're going to next. What is different about all of these birds? So look at each bird, and what do you think is different about them? If you said their beak size and their leg size, you would be correct. Because all of these birds live in the same ecosystem and they all have different beak sizes, they're able to coexist because they can eat at different locations in the ecosystem. The flamingo obviously has the longest legs and longest neck, so it can go the deepest in the water to get the food it needs. And it will avoid competition with ducks because they can eat in more shallow areas, whereas the other birds' adaptations are fit for less water, and more land. All right, so now we can start to define and talk about how niches are involved in competition. Okay, so competition is defined when two organisms want the same resource. Maybe one/need the same resource. Okay, and that could be food. That could be, let's write that down. Examples would be food, could be shelter, could be mates. Okay, so space, which actually would be shelter. There's a lot of things that organisms can compete for. Those are just a couple of the common ones. Now, when you look at, what makes a species compete, I will let you know that two different species can compete for the same food. Two different species can compete for the same shelter. But when you're looking at the word mate, you can only, the same species is going to compete for the same mate. You can't have two different species competing for a female because you have to be that same species to be able to mate with them. Okay? Now, this is where we get into something that I know you haven't heard of before. You've heard of competition before. But the competitive exclusion principle, okay? To exclude something or to exclude someone means to not include them, to keep them out. So the competitive exclusion principle is if two niches completely overlap, one species has to leave, okay? So this is based on the idea that two niches cannot completely overlap. Okay, and one species, the weaker, or that weaker one will leave. Weaker species leaves. Well, what the heck do I mean by that? Let me go to the next slide real quick. Here I have two niches. Maybe this is niche number 1 for bird number 1. Maybe this is niche number 2. Here, where they do not, those circles, the niches do not overlap at all, there's no competition. The more they overlap, here's where they're going to start to compete, area of competition. And then they're going to compete a little bit more, and they have a bigger area of competition. Then they're going to compete a little more. This can coexist. This you see in a lot of ecosystems. But if you see niche number 1 completely overlap niche number 2, you're going to have such a high extreme case of competition that one species has to leave, and it's usually the weaker one. So whoever the weaker bird is going to leave. Whoever the weaker fish is going to leave. And so this is where you're going to see fighting, maybe to the death, or maybe just to the removal, like, being the migration of one species out of the ecosystem. So if we go back, can two species occupy the same niche? The answer to that is absolutely not. So I'm going to get my pen, no, and put too much competition. The next thing in the packet says to explain why each of the finches have different beaks, think genetics, and then explain why they can coexist in the same environment. These are going to be finch birds that are the same birds from the Beaks of Finches lab in evolution. And if you notice, they all have different shaped beaks. Okay, some are shorter, some are longer, some are pointier, and they're all used for different things. This bird's beak is used for this type of food. This bird's beak is for seeds, leaves, insects, different tools like probing, and then grubs. And the reason why they're different is because they have different genetics. These beaks are due to different genes. Every organism that looks different has different traits because they have different genetics, just like the reason why you and I look different in class. But those different traits and those different genes could have different survival values. Now, that's, again, an evolution thing. Right now, we're talking about how can they coexist, okay? You can only coexist in areas of low composition, okay? So low competition for food. These birds can live in the same environment because they're not competing for the same food. And they're not competing for the same food because they have different genetics that allow them to have different beaks so that they cannot compete for a different food. So in the previous slide, we talked about how if two birds needed the same niche and were eating the same thing in the same spot, one species would have to leave. Here we're saying that because of that, the majority of the birds do have different beaks and they can coexist in a different environment or the same environment because they eat different things. But they didn't just get those different beaks because they didn't want to compete. This was due to evolution. This is due to mutations, and it's a genetic thing. And that genetic linking is important, and it's important that when we go into evolution, we'll explain a little bit more. All right, so now we're going to talk about animal relationships. So we're going to look at predator-prey, and then we're going to look at herbivore-producer. And so when we look at predator-prey relationships, which it goes over these relationships in page 103 in your book, this is a diagram that I want that you have in black and white. So I want you to pause the video, and I want you to trace with your red pen the mountain lion pattern on the bottom, and then trace the outside box of the mountain lion in red. If you don't have a red pen, you can use a different color. Just make sure that you can have a distinction between the two patterns of the graph. Okay, so at this point you should have done that, and you should have outlined the red and the red population pattern for the mountain lion, and outlined the box. In this, I want you to figure out who is the predator and who is the prey. So just think of it. Who do you think it is? All right, so you should have said that the predator is the mountain lion, okay? And the prey is the rabbit. So I want you to label, this is the prey, and this is the predator. Now, if you didn't get that right, let's talk about why. How could you tell it from a graph? You always have to have more prey than predators. Okay, when we draw our energy pyramid, we're going to producers way down the bottom. They're the most abundant in the ecosystem, and then the herbivores are the second most abundant, and then your consumers. As you go up each trophic level on a food web, you decrease in how many you have of that particular level. And so you have to have more prey than predators. And so if you look at the patterns here, I'm actually going to use a different color to make it stick out. I'm going to use purple. When you look at the prey is always higher than the mountain lions, but their patterns kind of, they coincide with each other. When you see a peak right here of the rabbits, you see an increase, a rise in mountain lions. But then when you see an increase in mountain lions, you see a sharp drop in the prey, and then you're going to see a sharp drop in the predators. So they have a relationship that's dependent on one another. And so I want you to write, I'm going to move this down a little bit, underneath the graph, I would like for you to write that, when the prey's population goes up, the predator's population goes up. So when the prey's population goes up, the predators go up. But at the same time, when the prey's population goes down, the predators go down. So they have a relationship with one another that's dependent. Okay, so now we're going to go over herbivore plant. So if you remember, herbivores eat producers. They eat plants. And so this one I just want to give an example. An example would be a rabbit eating clover. So when you look at the chart when we talked about the mountain lion and the hare above, when you look at that population dependency, it's the same here. If the clover population goes up, the rabbit population is going to go up. If the rabbit population goes up, the clover population is going to go down. So it goes back into saying that your niche isn't pretty important because you control the population sizes of other species in the environment. And that leads us to our word keystone species. Okay? The word keystone species is a word specific to organisms that play an important role in the ecosystem. So they are important for the stability of the ecosystem, they're important for the stability of the ecosystem, and if they were removed, the ecosystem would change drastically. Okay, and I'm just going to have you write down this example, and then we're actually going to go over it in class. I'm going to show you some videos in class. The sea otter in the kelp forest. Okay, we are going to write that in an example, and then when we get back to class, we're going to draw that out. We're going to look at some food webs with or without the sea otter and see how drastically the kelp forest changes when that one species is removed. So it's so important that we call it the keystone species.